I see very little of that kind of love, I said to Steve, after a few moments of thinking about it. As I said, mostly people don't give a damn about anyone but themselves. And that's not love. That's not possible, Steve interjected. If people truly cared about themselves as human beings, they would find that living without the principle of universal love is not an option, but is dangerous poverty and inhumanity that will kill them. People cannot live that way. Humanity and its principle of universal love are one. Without this principle, humanity dies. While this is not recognized anymore in our time, all isn't lost yet, Peter. We, as society, do carry the responsibility for the world in which we live. This may yet become apparent when the dream world falls apart that people live in, and reality reasserts itself again. The dream of fascist prosperity is doomed to end. It is still possible for this reality to be recognized before the consequences of the long dreaming overwhelm society. One way or another, society will determine for itself what kind of world it will live in, and in which its living has meaning. If it drops this responsibility, it will suffer by default, as Germany did by allowing Hitler to rule. Yes, the German nation was trapped by Goebbels' propaganda. In a dream state this is possible, but in a state of consciousness ruled by the principle of universal love, this mental entrapment would not have been possible. Nevertheless, the German nation could not escape the consequences of its folly in which it allowed fascist masters to rule. I agree, the environment of the principle of universal love is a fragile environment in its early stages, I interjected, but right now one can find hardly a trace of this principle anymore, certainly not, as one should find it. Almost nobody cares, Steve. That is why civilization will likely disintegrate in due course, as it did in Hitler's Germany. In Hitler's Germany, the people were not victims of Hitler. That came later. First and foremost, they were victims of their own foolishness. If the people of a nation don't have enough love for themselves as human beings that they take whatever steps may be necessary to remove the defective leaders from power, then society isn't fit to survive, and it won't survive. A fascist leader in power is like an elephant in a china shop. If you want to protect what is precious, get the elephant out. The people in Germany failed to do this. We are failing the same way all over the world now, and that's only the beginning. In our modern world, people have become even more deeply corrupted than the people had been under Hitler. Now people sooner steal from one another and tear each other down, by which they lose their civilization and the foundation for their existence, than to create riches for one another by building a richer world. We are far from living in a democracy in which people take responsibility for their existence. I know what you're getting at, I interrupted Steve. You are saying that the train of all the historic tragedies was set into motion, not by men from Mars, but by society itself, when it allowed itself to become little people, underlings, paying homage to their empire gods, gods of greed, and force, and destruction. They honor Hobbes and Adam Smith today, the man who outlawed love. How much sadder can things get? Right, Peter. Don't love one another, love that gold. That's the new prayer song. Are you surprised then that our government reflects this? Steve asked. That's what I see happening in America all the way to the top, to the very president of the nation, said Steve, just as it is happening in many other places. What you see in today's world would never be possible anywhere if society were like the Samaritan, or even be supporting its Samaritans. then society would do everything possible to uplift and defend its humanity anywhere in the world and heal what needs healing. If there were a deep love in society for its humanity, society would create itself the type of government that would be mandated to provide education for all, universal healthcare, low-cost financing for its advancing industries, and its infrastructures for living, such as sufficient housing and efficient transportation infrastructures. Yes, Peter, the Samaritan represents the general welfare principle and the principle of the universal brotherhood of all mankind and the principle of universal love. The Samaritan isn't supported. This means that society isn't supporting itself. The Samaritan represents all of these principles, the only foundation that exists in the universe with the substance to support a human civilization. That foundation, although it was probably not scientifically understood, was most likely the platform that enabled humanity to survive the many ice ages it had to face throughout its 2.5 million year history. Otherwise, no one might have survived. Ironically, our global society is now in the process of scrapping all of that and expects to face the return of the ice age. Without it, and with a 10 billion world population, that will be running out of food when the cold climate begins and agriculture becomes disabled thereby. Society must be insane to expect to be able to survive that way. Society is in need of a deep-reaching healing. Are you saying, Steve, that the global society has become truly insane? Or has it merely become incompetent? Steve nodded slightly. I am suggesting that society needs a lot of healing in both respects. Its incompetence is reflected in society electing an incompetent idiot to the highest office in the land. That's clear evidence of universal incompetence, isn't it, if it isn't insanity? The sad fact is that society has become grossly incompetent in the basic requirements for its survival. Our Constitution has all the safeguards included that give society the tools to keep its government on track, but when society becomes incompetent, what good are those tools? Who will use them in a world without sanity? Are you saying that the Samaritan represents what the competent human being is, and that Christ Jesus already understood 2 millennia ago the deep challenges that we face today? Steve nodded again. Why are you surprised, Pete? That man stood on the shoulders of giants. He stood on the shoulders of Homer, Aeschylus, Pythagoras, Solon, Socrates, Plato, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and many others. He understood what a human being is. He also stood on the shoulders of his people's countless spiritual pioneers from Abraham to Elijah. He understood the royalty and divinity of mankind. He saw in the human being the image of the Supreme Being, and the intelligence that is reflected in all of the universe. Anyone who lived in this age, and was a thinking human being, was moved to some degree by the scientific revolution that had been unfolding at this time, that was everywhere like the sand that gets into one's hair at the seashore. Do you think it would have been possible for someone like Christ Jesus to emerge on the world scene outside of this enormously rich humanist environment of scientific competence? That's not possible, Pete. People have always discovered their humanity in the processes of discovering the principles of the universe that the eye cannot see. They found their humanity by living in the complex domain, the stuff that we talked about before. The world that Gauss lived in, the world of the complex domain of the infinite mind. The scientific understanding of the great pioneers of the past, their discovery of the unknowable that is scientifically knowable, that the eye cannot see but the mind can discern, made them stand tall as human beings akin with a god, standing as champions of the principles of the universe. Thereby they became more fully aware of what a human being is. They became more fully human by their scientific development. That's what Christ Jesus carried forward. The figure of the Samaritan in his story is but a minimal image, if that. Of course today, even this minimal image is shunned. Who is even talking about universal principles anymore? We don't recognize the elementary stuff anymore, much less what was once built on it. Who is talking about Homer in today's world, and Aeschylus, Pythagoras, Solon, Socrates, Plato, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and so forth? Nobody is. That's the rich kind of human culture that the Roman Empire has destroyed with its anti-human rampage through history, that is now being reinvented. They say that the Roman Empire nearly destroyed civilization. I think the reality is worse. The Roman Empire has destroyed civilization. What we have left of it doesn't really qualify for the term anymore. How many atomic bombs do we have now stacked up around the world? I hear the count stands now at 65,000. We call this a civilization? It's a horror show. On this tragic platform we want to build an Ice Age Renaissance civilization with indoor agriculture that can support 10 billion people. Is this what we want to do? That's not on society's agenda, by what I can see, I interjected. I don't think we have any intention to even consider this path. Society is kidding itself if it thinks it can survive on any other path, said Steve. Anyone who thinks that the needed Ice Age Renaissance to save civilization, in a time of the deepest transformation of our planet, can be created on the present platform of total incompetence, is insane. In that respect we may have already lost the game of saving civilization, I interjected. Society only doesn't know it yet. It's not that bad, Peter. Our American Constitution represents the Samaritan's principles. We may yet have a chance to reverse course. Yes, our Constitution has enshrined the principle of universal love to some degree, Steve, but who cares about our Constitution? Not even the president does. No president has spoken about the general welfare principle during the recent decades, much less has implemented it. I agree, said Steve. It's sad what we see being done in America, in general, with our Constitution. The American people spit on it. They spit on the principle of the general welfare. They destroy their own industries with the blind and perverted zeal of a Don Quixote, as if their industries were a great evil. By doing so, the American people are acting against themselves in the most ferocious fashion, nicely obedient to the demands of empire. Why can't anyone see that? We've become underlings to artificially induced insanity. Everything that we human beings need for our physical existence is produced in a factory, in an industry, or has been produced and delivered by equipment once made in a factory of an industry. But all of this is being shut down in the brave new age of deindustrialization, as if industrial production was an evil demon that has to be killed. Then, in order to avoid the consequences of our industrial devolution, America forces other people around the world to produce the goods for it that its demolished industries had once produced. You can't call this competent existence. When the Constitution was created, people still spoke the names of Homer, Aeschylus, Pythagoras, Solon, Socrates, Plato, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, at least to some degree. But now, hardly anyone even recognizes the names. We've lost our link as a society with the foundational principles of our civilization, which is all that we've got to provide for our physical existence. LaRouche still speaks the names of Homer and Aeschylus, Pythagoras, Solon, Socrates, Plato, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and so forth, I interrupted Steve. Steve nodded. I know, Peter, I am fully aware of that. That's why society is slandering the man. Society treats him like an idiot because it doesn't have an ear to hear a single word of what he is talking about. That's a natural response of a society stupefied by cultural warfare, Peter. A society that lives in the sewer like a rat and thinks like a rat will treat anyone as a fool who doesn't measure up to the yardstick of the sewer. It's natural that those who live like rats make a vicious sport out of trashing those people's names according to the common courtesy of rat. That's natural, Peter. The rats have to treat these people like outsiders, especially LaRouche, because he is an outsider to their sewer-bound world. I would be shocked if the rats would treat him like a brother. He doesn't live there, and neither should anybody else. If his name is being slandered in the White House, as you say it is, then the White House is advertising to the nation that it has become a sewer. That's a tragedy, Peter, which reflects itself on the whole nation. That is what we need to heal for the sake of the nation and of humanity as a whole. That is why the president should resign for reasons of incompetence. He wants to throw nuclear bombs around while the economy is disintegrating under the weight of his policies that idealize looting. And the financial system that should be supporting the physical economy has become an empty shell. What comes out of this sewer doesn't smell like a civilization to me at all. It stinks. It stinks worse than a sewer. Steve paused and shook his head. What's to become of our country? He said. We are throwing our workers on the scrap heap and make slaves out of the rest of the world, and then the president stands up and wants to throw nuclear bombs at the very people who are feeding our empty shell with the substance of their life. The Samaritan would never dream of doing that, but would do the opposite. However, the priest and the Levite would do this, I interjected. We can't allow them to have their way, not in a nuclear-armed world, and definitely not in a human world. Now you are talking, Peter. But get on with it, Peter. Don't just talk. Rescue your fellow citizens from the sewer. Don't think for one minute that government policies can turn the trend around and ennoble society, said Steve. That leadership has to come from the pioneers of society, and from their heart and soul. The historic Golden Renaissance hadn't been brought to life as a policy of government, Peter. It began with people discovering the truth about their humanity. When society begins to cherish the spiritual qualities that make us all human, that give us our strength, of which love is a vital element, the Renaissance that corresponds with that simply happens. I don't think we are anywhere near of that happening now. We need to act decisively to get us there. Society should be acting like the Samaritan, upholding the principle of the universal brotherhood of all mankind. But that's not happening. It isn't even on the horizon, much less on the agenda. I bet, Peter, America is treating LaRouche like a dog, throwing him a few scraps, barely enough to survive on. That's deemed a noble gesture in the mental vocabulary of the sewer rats, which society loves to be. They support him just enough to keep him alive, but not enough for him to be effective in rescuing society from its self-imposed trap. The rats don't want to be rescued. It's simpler to live like a rat than to live like a human being. As a rat, you don't have to take responsibility for anything. You just swim with the sewer. But this hell will freeze over, and everyone in it, Pete, long before the Ice Age begins anew. What you described is a state of living without love, I interjected. You have described the Hobbesian world, the Malthusian world, refined an aroma into the world of Adam Smith. But that's not the real face of humanity, isn't it? That's the face of fascism. The face of humanity isn't the face of fascism. The humanity that I have come to know wears an infinitely brighter face. You, yourself, are a witness to that, and a part of it. Steve shrugged his shoulders. What do you want me to say, Pete? Do you want me to tell you a lie that makes you feel better? The simple fact is that there is not enough of the light of love and humanity evident in the world, much less is flooding the world. We are not there yet, which isn't even a goal yet. We are far short off the critical threshold being recognized on the global scene, to say nothing of it being acknowledged. The sewer has been globalized, with all its stench and darkness, not the principle of universal love. Without love for our humanity, and I do mean universal love, not privatized love, there is no general welfare focus happening. And consequently no real economic activity happening. Without even the faintest recognition of the principle of the universal brotherhood of all mankind, a productive economy can't be unfolding. Because an economy unfolds only from the substance of our humanity. In the shadow of the present void, governments become fascist by nature. Fascism is a state of living without principle, without humanity, without love, with an empty heart, and a life without a kiss. That is what we have come to. That's the sewer, Peter. Nevertheless, we do remain what we are, human beings. We will always be human beings, no matter what mask we wear, or what role we choose to play, and what rotten ideology we devour. We will always remain what we are, human beings, and if we are lucky we will wake up to this fact soon. There have been times of renaissance in the past, bright times of culture, science, love, and humanity, when this awakening happened in a big and universal way. Sure, every trend towards Renaissance became smothered again by the darkness of empire, but the fact that those Renaissance trends have happened is important even if they didn't last. These bright spots in history, in which a bright humanism had flourished with a deep-reaching healing for humanity, are important, Pete, because from them we can gain a glimpse of what a human being is and is still capable of achieving. That is how we learn that a human being is not by nature a sewer rat, but bears the image of the Supreme Being, in our world, the reflected image of God. You are saying then, that Christ Jesus constructed his parable correctly. The fourth-person edition that we have explored isn't fundamentally necessary in a Renaissance world. In the normal world of mankind, I said to Steve. Someone once told me that the way to extract error, and that's the sewer of the world, is to pour into this dehumanized scene floodtides of love. The priest and the Levite represent the sewer, and the Samaritan represents the process of pouring in floodtides of love to enrich the human scene. Nothing more is needed than pouring in floodtides of love to enrich the human scene. In the parable, the Samaritan had rendered the priest and the Levite as inconsequential. The effect of darkness is inconsequential in a world of light. If today's society says, and that probably includes almost everyone today, that the welfare of humanity isn't their business, then we hear in them the priest and the Levite talking, those sporting new faces and wearing new gowns while they are playing the same old game. A change of the facade doesn't imply a change of heart. Most people, like the priest and Levite, are saying with their deeds that the welfare of mankind, much less its future, isn't their concern. Fortunately, the sad statement doesn't reflect the true image of mankind. It only reflects the face of a delusion. The true face has been put into the bottle of a delusion. Uncork the bottle, said Steve, and laughed. Set the genie free. Smash the bottle. Smash anything that would put the genie of mankind into a bottle. This becomes a declaration of war on false religion, and the like. How often have we seen the holy men of countless religions retreating into passive prayer and meditation? Said Steve. They are seeking healing in their silent isolation from the world as they aim to find unity with their God. But the infinite all, who is their God, is the universe. Withdrawal is not prayer. It is self-delusion. In this passive meditation, the deluded holy men convince themselves that their needs, and the needs of mankind, are small and insignificant, and are met by spiritual magic. But this never happens. And so, as the parable has foretold the priest's response, they close their heart and their hand, and let the human needs remain unmet. They act with resolve, and commit the injured, and those starving in poverty, to their death. They pray to God to have a toothache repaired, I interjected. In their smallness they tell themselves that the welfare of humanity isn't their business. They say that the Samaritan's principle of pouring into the human scene floodtides of love is irrelevant. And so they fall into their own trap, and fail where they would succeed, and become irrelevant. Steve nodded. This challenge confronts us in all aspects of healing. Because it takes a lot of honesty with ourselves to pour into the human scene floodtides of love. Who even acknowledges the principle of universal love? But even if society were to do all of this fully, they would still miss half of the story of the parable. I nodded slightly. Okay, Peter, tell me what that missing half is. What is a part of this process of pouring into the human scene floodtides of love? It is something greater than creating a richer world. I think the Apostle John had recognized that already 2,000 years ago. John had suggested that love brings us into the sphere of thinking where we see God, I said to Steve cautiously. That's the sphere of coming alive where mankind actually begins to experience God. John suggested that who doesn't love on a universal plane cannot see God and therefore has no part in God. Such a person literally misses reality, even his own reality. That's like saying that without universal love, a person doesn't measure up to what a human being is, and therefore doesn't qualify for the term. Consequently, civilization disintegrates. That's powerful stuff, eh? Said Steve. That's why all the religions have failed. They miss the key elements. They have become but so many variations of a failing theme. Some have come closer than others, but they are all hollow. They miss the core element, the fundamental substance, the divinely real. Love is the real, and loving is the divine way. The principle of universal love is the principle of the divine dance of humanity. That's why I think we need a new renaissance of competent living based on the principle of universal love, I interjected. Ever since we first met here in Leipzig, Steve, I was fascinated with this great challenge of coming to terms with the demands of the principle of universal love. We both were. Steve just laughed. You speak of the ultimate. Right now, I would be happy if you could manage to start an emergency education of your president to take one single step in that direction and love to himself as a human being. This would be enough to deter him from blowing up the world, whereby we might have a chance to see the new renaissance being created that brings to light the divine dance. You can't pull a renaissance out of a hat. Just as you can't implement the principle of universal love with mere slogans. It takes a deep overturning in every arena of human living. And more than one step to flush out all the sewer paradigms with the flood tide of the substance of our humanity. Here universal love begins. It takes a great humanist effort to create a renaissance, the kind of effort that Franklin Roosevelt had once made to inspire our nation into living like human beings. If he hadn't done that, Hitler would have overrun the world, and most of us would be dead by now, or be saluting the swastika and shouting Heil Hitler. We need the Roosevelt kind of renaissance again that had saved us once from this potential tragedy, and then create a still greater renaissance of love. We need to flood the world with healing. With love, to be true to what we are as a people clothed with the sun of our humanity. We need this kind of a renaissance, even the brightest possible, as a starter, to build on it the needed still bigger renaissance that a century from now enables us to survive the return of the Ice Age. Getting our incompetent would-be king to resign appears to be terribly hard, I said to Steve, but it is probably the easiest part of what is required. To find a competent replacement from a society that lives in the sewer will be much harder. In a world that is saturated with boisterous priests and Levites, you have to look far and wide to find a Samaritan who understands the principles of economics and civilization, who understands what a human being is. My guess is that the second step will prove to be impossible, because the deeper a society has drifted into the sewer, the harder it is for it to find a way out of it. Not taking this step, however, no matter how hard it may be, will break the back of America, said Steve. America will collapse as a consequence of such a failure, should this happen. That's what I fear may indeed be happening. Because I see no universal movement happening to rebuild our sense of humanity that would stop the already ongoing collapse into a new dark age. LaRouche has a mass movement of sorts, I interrupted Steve. I bet he knows that this is not sufficient, Peter. A mass movement by itself won't do it. It may serve as a catalyst to inspire a universal movement, but nothing short of a universal movement will cause what is required. We need a new renaissance from the grassroots level up. If this is the case, I said to Steve, what profound idea do you have to offer that can break the barrier and inspire the needed universal movement? Steve shrugged his shoulders. The principle of the universal brotherhood is the tallest moral principle that I know. It reflects the divine principle of the reality of our being. The principle of God, or the universe, the principle of our divinity as human beings, and so on. I raised my hand as if to object. People would say, Steve, don't bring God into this, please. There may be no God. Steve just laughed. That's what the rats are saying indeed. I say that the principle of the universal brotherhood stands on a divine principle that no one can really define, which is all and everything at the same time, a kind of divine spark. We are all human beings, cast from the same mold, reflecting the same inner humanity, sharing the same universal human soul. And still, we are more than just that. We are more than just cast from the same mold. There is a spark in us that drives us to reach beyond ourselves, to embrace and to understand the universe, and to move with it, and to explore and to utilize its riches. You can't measure that spark, but you can bury it so deep under shallow philosophies and doctrines that its light no longer shines. And that's what's been happening for decades now. We've buried it under empiricism, religiosity, and romanticism, and of course the modern irrational monetarism and fascism, but we are nevertheless still bound to the spark, because when it is hidden we cannot escape the consequences that we thereby invite. The bottom line is, Peter, that there are basically no innocent victims in the world. Sure, children and the like may be innocent victims of society's folly, but for society as a whole the concept of the innocent victim doesn't apply. When society allows the humanist spark to be smothered by its actions and civilization vanishes in the resulting collapse process, and consequently the whole world goes to hell in a nuclear war, there will be no innocent victims affected by this. No Martian forces mankind into this trend. It's all the result of its own doing then, of its own failing to adhere to the principle of civilization. No innocent victims? I repeated. The concept of innocent victims is essentially invalid in the world of democracy, said Steve, because democracy means taking responsibility to live profoundly as human beings, utilizing all the resources within us to create a richer and more secure world. The guilt for the death of children that results from our folly falls on us all. It is our responsibility to support them. If we carry out our duty competently, our children will live and enrich our world. If we choose to live like sewer rats and shrug off our responsibility, we will have what the sewer provides, which isn't very pretty or in any way secure. There aren't any bystanders, basically. You are right, Peter. We either live in the sewer or in the light above it, and the deeper we sink into the sewer, the harder it gets to climb out of it and flush out the stench with flood tides of love. I said the same to Sylvia, I said. When a village is threatened that is located downstream from a great dam that shows signs of breaking up, everybody is affected. Even those who say that the dam is not their business are affected. They may insist that they have other business to focus on, like a garden to tend, a wife to marry, a family to feed, but this does not make them any less affected by the breaking dam. Everybody that lives in that village is affected, and affects the outcome. People either become victims of their incompetence, and advance the outcome in which they die, or they become victors by responding as they should, and affect the outcome by their effort as the dam becomes repaired, or the water behind it becomes safely diverted. In that case, they succeed in saving their world by responding in the manner that a human being is designed to respond, and is capable of responding. Steve applauded. The same holds true for responding to the Ice Age, Peter, said Steve. When 10 billion people perish at the return of the Ice Age, they won't perish as innocent victims because mankind has the resources within it to prevent this tragedy. You don't even have to go that far to recognize the principle, I interjected. If an economy collapses, and society collapses with it, it does so because of its own self-victimization, its own incompetence. If war erupts, and nuclear war wipes out humanity, there are basically no innocent victims, either, for one to mourn over. It will be the result of society's long-standing self-victimization, by banishing the qualities that make us human. That's why the development of the principle of universal love is so enormously important, Peter, said Steve. That's why sexual love appears to be the one remaining arena where a little bit of fire and passion for our humanity, and for human living, still remains. People want to be honest in this arena, as you know yourself, even if they can't quite get to that yet, or only with great difficulties. Of course sexual love is important, I said. It's one of the most powerful motivators we've got, as you know yourself, said Steve. The whole world is divided along sexual lines. Love is banned, except in those narrowly defined circumstances that we don't want to let go no matter what. But doesn't that hint at what we are missing in the larger domain? The principle of universal love in the sexual domain is bound to become an explosive issue, I interjected. Yes, and it will blow the whole scene of universal love wide open, as it impels people to deal with it, whether they like it or not, said Steve. Doesn't that illustrate how defective the world has become, that we need to fix? I said. The sexual division and isolation goes extremely deep, Peter, as you also know. That's why universal love has also been blocked for centuries from unfolding. We have to address that issue, as a part of the development of the principle of universal love, on the whole front. No, I think we have to address the development of the principle of universal love especially on the sexual front, where it has been held back almost completely, I countered Steve. Nothing less than a profound victory there will do any good. The good thing is that it is there where society is most interested in getting out of its box. Sexual division and isolation created the box. To get out of this box is an essential first step for getting back to the platform of competent living. That's what I said Steve. The sexual domain is where people want to be honest with themselves. We should promote this already existing trend towards the principle of universal love. Haven't we already begun, Steve? I said to him, and laughed. Hasn't the process of healing started at the moment when I set foot into your house? No, Pete, it started the moment you met Lucy on the beach, remember? Steve began to grin now, but quickly became serious again. It really started long before that. It started on the day you were born, added Steve. That's what we need to get back to our natural humanity in which the principle of universal love is expressed, and allow it to unfold. But aren't you forgetting the force of imperial domination that is controlling society, and is making a mockery of love with nuclear weapons, and is reducing sex to a scam? I asked him. Sure, Peter, the Imperials corrupt society, but society complies. It does the Imperials' bidding. That's not love. The principle of the universe does not change to accommodate society's self-denial. Where there is no love, society dies, just as a person dies who refuses to breathe. When society refuses love, it refuses itself and becomes hollow. The intelligence and the power of the universe, or God, as some say, is incorporeal. It has no form. It unfolds being incorporated by us. The physical universe and we in it are the corporeal form of the intelligence of the universe and its principle. We are its expression, its manifest, its intention, its spirit unfolding in life, the reflection of its mind, soul, love, and so on. Its soul is our beauty, its principle our power, its love our loving, its mind our intellect, and so on. All of what is good, true, and of value unfolds along this chain in which unfolds the native quality of God and man as one. It unfolds a unity that is divine, supreme, and infinite. This channel defines all that we are as human beings, where the outcome is good. The incorporeal divine being is manifest in our corporeal individual living. That's the native state of humanity. It determines civilization, and our freedom for action, and also the limits beyond which we lose ourselves in self-denial. On this platform of all that is real, love is the principle of humanity, the substance of civilization, the light that can eradicate empire. If society doesn't choose to let this light shine in active expression, it allows the emptiness of empire to assert itself in its lifeless state. When the light goes out, the void of darkness resumes. The path society pursues determines its experience. Of course, the Martians don't dictate our actions, whether we love universally or don't love at all, I interjected. We alone do this. We, humanity, inhabit this planet. No one else calls the shots here, and suffers the consequences if we act foolishly. The determining factor here is whether we choose to move with God, which is the intention for us to exist, said Steve, whereby our living and loving becomes meaningful, or whether we foolishly move against God, whereby our life loses its meaning, as if we had never lived. The first is the natural state of mankind, which is ever developing, like a seed that becomes a tree. The second is the inactive state, where nothing good happens, and the seed dies as if it never existed. If we get nuked this afternoon, added Steve, we suffer the consequences of having never really lived. By not living as human beings, we allow our world to deteriorate to such a deep point in the sewer war we exist without love, that the insanity drives society into nuclear war. When this happens, we'll suffer the consequences of the folly of our inaction. One might call this our utter failure in loving one another as human beings. But this failure isn't a default state. There is a choice involved. Nuclear war is one of the many phenomena of insanity that we drift into by choice when our humanity becomes actively denied and universal love becomes blocked. We are getting close to realizing the effect of this choice, Peter. We've got 65,000 nuclear bombs to prove that we have made this choice. However, we can also choose to live as human beings again, and act with the expressed intention of the intelligence of the universe as the corporeal manifest of God. Thereby the human becomes divine in our living, as it is by design, and the outcome is civilization. No one is excluded from this potential. In this we are one. Steve explained that it is a rarely recognized fact that humanity is a universal whole, an inseparable singularity united in a universal bond that unfolds as love. If our humanity inspires love for ourselves and for one another, then we enrich one another and our world, and our society with it, and uplift our civilization out of the riches of that love. That's the economic process and the natural political process. No one stands apart from that flow. No one is not touched by its imperative. If society corrupts itself with greed and poverty, it suffers the consequences as the world is collapsing. When society as a whole becomes trapped into the self-collapse process, no one remains untouched by the result. The bottom line is that we're all bound to each other in a natural unity that no one can escape from, said Steve. We are individuals only to the degree to which we explore and apply the fundamental principles of our humanity and of our universe. Apart from that, we are all bound to the effects of these principles. Sure, we can rebel and ignore or deny the principles of our humanity, as we so often do, but we cannot escape the consequences of this rebellion. We cannot escape the fact that we are all one in being, and therefore have a responsibility for one another. We certainly can't escape the outcome of our response to the return of the Ice Age, which may only be 100 years away. We can protect ourselves from it by uplifting our world in a human manner, and thus avoid the otherwise deadly consequences. That's how the principle of universal love gets us into our native era of humanist power. Failing that, we face a horrendous tragedy. I told Steve about the elderly Japanese that I met in the airplane flying across the Atlantic to Germany. I told Steve that he had told me the same thing, only in a still higher level spiritual and scientific context. That's just another facet of the same phenomenon, said Steve. It is reflecting the same principle in a different manner, in different metaphors. We need to look at everything that has inspired and uplifted individuals to enrich society. But there is still another facet that you need to be aware of, added Steve. This facet lies above all that. According to all available evidence, the development of life on this planet appears to be fundamentally non-linear. It comes to light as a voluntaristic process of intelligently directed progression or creation, in which mankind itself becomes a part of the creative process. Steve explained that the most potent force in a physical economy are the small entrepreneurial industries that thrive on the wave of new ideas and advanced innovations. That's a voluntaristic process. These enterprises depend on exceptional ideas for their very existence. They become synonymous with it. But where do the grand and powerful ideas come from? We don't really know, do we? Where does our humanity come from, Peter, except to see it rooted in the intelligence of the universe and its principles? We don't know that either. Darwin calls it evolution, but he didn't really believe that himself, did he? He has admitted that much, cautiously, as much as he dared. He was a member of the Empire. His hypotheses were built on speculation to serve what was politically correct for his time, a time darkened by empire. He had to deliver a rendition that fell within the parameters that were predetermined for him to serve the empire. The truth wasn't really relevant at this stage, was it? It still isn't. So he fibbed a bit. But our getting back to the truth, as we must get back to it, changes everything. Life isn't a process of linear accretion through mindless actions. It unfolds in qualitative jumps, in principle-directed intelligent jumps. Can we say that ideas emerge through evolution? We can never say that, can we? Evidently, ideas don't result from the molasses of mental accretion. Ideas are explosive phenomena. They unfold in a bang and are often totally complete. Neither does life unfold by evolutionary accretion. It unfolds like a new idea is born. It erupts in new forms of expression, perhaps even intelligently self-directed forms of expression. Are art, beauty, music, loyalty, honor, and love drawn from evolution? No. I can't believe that they are. Nobody really knows where the cradle of intelligence lies. Evidence suggests that intelligence was its own cradle and is powered by its own development, and that its principles and manifestation, that we are a part of, have shaped us into becoming what we are. The resulting scientific concept lies a far distance from the deadly passive notion of random evolution. There is more evidence abounding that life is voluntaristically determined, with a creative intention behind it, and is actively unfolding, rather than passively by default random motion. My point is that we know far too little about ourselves, which naturally also becomes reflected in the damned small-minded thinking that is destroying our world today. We are so arrogant in our small-minded thinking, which we call knowledge, that we aim to circumscribe all truth with this smallness. If you are correct, I said to Steve, then we are the ongoing creators of what we call the truth, without knowing that we are creators, and thereby the shapers of life. It is more likely than not that we uplift truth itself as we uplift our civilization, and give pinions to life as we expand our universe. We create new elements of truth that did not exist before us, because the world did not exist that these elements of truth pertain to. Give me an example, said Steve. I began to laugh. Look at the tip of your finger, that's what Fred would say. Who does it point to? It points to you. It points to us all. We are the evidence, the example, and the exemplar, Steve. The modern world and its vast population exists because of us, as creators of resources and builders of infrastructures for living. The so-called natural world might be able to support a few million people out of its primitive resources, but human intelligence has created a higher-level world that now supports 5 billion people. We created an aspect of truth that didn't exist before. Nevertheless, we cannot step outside the fundamental principles that are established by the universe itself. Sure, we have created the principles of agriculture. However, we did this on established universal principles by discovering how the biological platform operates. We have built a marvelous infrastructure on this platform that may soon support 10 billion people living on this planet. And here I see a real critical danger with the Ice Age approaching, for two of the critical elements of the biological platform will be deeply disabled by the coming Ice Age. Plant growth depends on the warm climate that the current interglacial period gave us. Plant growth also depends on a rich concentration of carbon dioxide in the air. The world's current CO2 concentration in the air is way below what is needed for efficient plant growth. It should be at a minimum of 1,000 ppm for that, instead of the mere 380 that we've got. Our biosphere is presently at a starvation level of CO2 deficiency. Both of these factors become increasingly critical in the coming Ice Age. Agriculture would be devastated by the radically colder climate, and also by the radically reduced CO2 concentration in the air that followed the colder temperatures in a downward response. Below the 200 ppm level, plant growth grinds to a stop. Ice core samples tell us that during the previous glaciation periods the CO2 level in the air dropped below the 150 mark. That's why only a few million people survived the last Ice Age. We can counteract these critical deficiencies that always devastate the human landscape in the glaciation periods. We can counteract it with indoor agriculture that enables scientific climate control for optimized plant growth conditions. But this won't happen, will it, if we don't allow our humanity its natural unfolding in reflecting the principles of the universe? Are you saying that this is the reason why the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many? I said. I told Steve how I had recited this principle to Fred, without understanding more than just a bit of it myself. At least you're honest, said Steve. Sure, this principle is critical to mankind's meeting the Ice Age challenge, but not in the way you may think. If we say that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, we are entering fascist territory, where no one will ultimately survive, I said cautiously. That's why the opposite has to be true. Steve applauded me. He raised a hand. You are getting warm, he said. Still, your reasoning is passive. For an active appreciation, you need to look at what's happening in the way the universe is operating. You mean how the universe proves the principle that the needs of the one outweighs the needs of the many? Steve nodded. Without this principle, the universe would not exist, said Steve. This is your proof. He paused. Since the answer to this puzzle is way out of your reach to discover, allow me to explain what stands behind it. While you are aware by now that in nuclear physics the electrons and protons in an atom are complementary, attractive to one another by their complementary polarities, and are complementary, protected by the same polarity, just as men and women are naturally attracted and protected in the social world, you fail to recognize that the atoms themselves are complementary in the larger context. When a single electron and a single proton are energetically bound into a dynamic atomic relationship, an atom results that is 1,000,000 times larger in size than the electron that circumscribes the family space. The outcome in this case is a hydrogen atom. However, the universe is slightly more complex than this. The dynamic structures of atoms are such that the electrons surrounding a nucleus occupy a certain space, which is rarely fully occupied. The occupation happens in layers upon layers for the larger atoms, like shells of rooms surrounding a nucleus. The universe is so arranged that each of the shells has a certain number of rooms available, which, when it doesn't have enough electrons in its own outer shell to fill them, makes the rooms available to be shared by electrons in the outer shells of other atoms. The arrangement is such that when several complementary atoms come close enough, they latch onto each other by sharing their outer rooms, in which additional electrons as guests from other atoms can reside. This is how water is created, by 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom latching onto each other. What are you getting at? I interrupted Steve. Can't you tell? This is profound, Peter, said Steve, smiling. The hydrogen atom represents the most basic possible form of marriage in the universe. It gives us the marriage of 2 single complementary polarities into a dynamically operating atom. This most basic model is reflected nearly universally as the marriage model of mankind. Our civilization hasn't progressed beyond that, or hasn't been allowed to progress. However, what we have here is an extremely rare occurrence in the universe. In the universe, most hydrogen atoms form atomic pairs. Every hydrogen atom has 2 rooms available in its shell. Its own electron occupies one. The other room is available for the sharing. And so, in general, 2 hydrogen atoms latch onto each other and form the H2 molecule. Most hydrogen gas on Earth exists in this form. This opens up an avenue for mankind to expand its marriage model. However, the universe doesn't stop there either. It created over 100 different types of larger and larger atoms, and with these, it created an infinite potential for molecular bonds, billions of which may already exist, many made up of hundreds of atoms bound together into complex molecular structures, or with an infinite number, in the case of the metals. The universe would not exist without them. If the universe was modeled after the model that mankind has chosen for its marriage model, the universe would be at best but a vast dark cloud of hydrogen gas. Most likely it would even exist at this primitive level. But this is the kind of platform that mankind has coerced itself to build its civilization on. That's why nothing works. That is why we have empires in the world that collapse our economies and unleash war, terror, fascism, and so on. Our civilization is in a starvation mode, Peter. We are trying to live on a platform on which the universe could not and would not exist. We are fooling ourselves when we believe that we can exist as a civilization on the primitive platform that we have chosen, for which no equivalent exists in the universe. If we want to rid the world of its nuclear war danger, we have to upgrade our basic social platform. Nothing less will do to eradicate empire. Likewise, we need to do this in order to develop the humanist power that we must require to create the needed infrastructures to get us through the next ice age. For this too, nothing less will be sufficient. And for this, you say, we need to look to the universe to discover the principles that are successfully operating there, which our marriage model, or models, should reflect. I interjected. Can you think of a better approach? Said Steve and laughed. We need a big breakthrough and fast. The reason you are here is proof that what we have isn't working. You have come halfway around the world to explore if we have a chance to survive another day. It's disgusting, Peter, that it has come to that. Nuclear war should be unknown, much less be an item for consideration, as should war in general. Neither should economic and financial collapse be known for the same reason, much less become a reality. Mankind should stand on a platform where empire is not possible, or even thinkable, from which all the wars, inhumanity, and economic destruction flow. The fact that empire is ruling the world today, and threatens the very extinction of mankind, proves that society is failing. That its model for civilization is failing. Which means that its social model is failing. And the fact that empire has ruled for the last 5,000 to 7,000 years, and often devastatingly so, proves that mankind has been operating on a defective social model for all that time. That's the model of our tiny marriages, that has isolated the whole of mankind so deeply that empire was allowed to become the ruling force of society. And so it still is, and empire still rules. That's the real reason why you are here, Peter. You are looking to me for a solution to a problem that shouldn't even exist. But all the cries of help me, to find a political solution won't solve anything in the current arena, because there is no political solution possible for a problem that isn't a political problem. Washington wants a band-aid solution, I interjected. Nobody in Washington is looking for a real solution. Nobody is allowed to. Washington has become a branch office of the ruling empire. That's why the real solution has to come from us, said Steve. For this, all the roads lead back to the universe that operates on the most profound, most efficient, and the most powerful platform imaginable, and has done so for countless billions of years, and possibly forever. But don't ask me what this means. We still have to discover what this means. At the very least, the model of the molecular hydrogen bond should prove to be useful where we have two atoms linked together by its electrons sharing each other's empty rooms. Can you imagine how much life this slightly improved model could bring into the social scene? The model for molecular hydrogen would be equivalent in human terms to two families sharing each other's spare bedroom. In this case, the complementary polarities that create this dual structure wouldn't be protons and electrons, but men and women, with each participating in their own way. This double complementary system happens to be the most abundantly found system in the natural sphere. How this model might be applied remains yet to be discovered, Peter. If we allow it, it might actually apply itself on its own rather naturally. Didn't you say that Fred is looking after Sylvia in your place while you are here? That's a good start for linking your two families together. In this case, you probably cannot imagine yet what the outcome of this process will be when it unfolds more fully. Steve began to grin. Fred isn't married, I interjected. What has this got to do with anything? Said Steve. Why shouldn't there be a complementary attraction unfolding between Fred and Sylvia? Throw the old model out. Think big. Think in unlimited terms. Think of the possibilities of creating a civilization without isolation. Anything that you can imagine in terms of relationships probably already exists in the universe. You don't have to step outside the sphere of the universe for that. That's not possible anyway. No one can step outside the universe. Even our small marriage model, which is the smallest that's theoretically possible where society exists in near total isolation from each other, exists as a model in the natural world, though rather rarely. But don't you think the time has come to explore some of the much more powerful models that play a powerful role in the universe? There are amazing molecules in existence, Peter, especially in the long and complex forms that life depends on. Or look at the chlorophyll molecule that captures sunlight and converts its energy into a form that enables a complex sequence of reactions by which the CO2 molecular bonds are separated into carbon that the plants use and oxygen that gets released into the air by which all animated life exists. That's how powerful molecular bonds can become in the natural world. In comparison with this promise, we haven't seen anything yet, socially, in terms of powerful marriage models. We seem to be still stuck at the Stone Age level with the same old model we had then, or have moved backwards from that. We are like the priest who stands at the seashore and picks up a single grain of sand and calls this the universe, while he should be embracing the entire seashore, and the sea, and the sky, and all the stars, and the galaxies, and the principles that are reflected in them, and so on. So you agree that the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many, I interjected. If meeting the needs of the one inspires us to discover and embrace grand and powerful models, then the whole of civilization becomes uplifted thereby, and becomes more powerful thereby in all its aspects. And that's the only way that civilization can be uplifted, isn't it? That's the nature of unfolding the principle of universal love, said Steve, and reached his hand out for a congratulation. The reverse, beginning with the needs of the many, isn't possible, because then one would miss the principle on which everything rests. Civilization rests on this process. It wouldn't exist without it. In following this course, we are dynamically one with the universe, and with its infinitely unfolding dimension, just as we are one with each other in the truth of universal love, I said to Steve. Maybe on this platform we can command the human universe, and it obeys us by its very nature, according to the principles that we thereby bring to light, with which we enrich one another. We have already discovered evidence to some degree that this universally enriching process is really possible. We see it already happening with our leading-edge experiences. So, how are you going to tell any of this to your president and get him to understand where the boundaries are located between failure and success? Said Steve. How can anyone predict anything with certainty when so much about our world and our humanity remains unknown, even to us, and nothing is predictable when the model is so out of whack that it breeds insanity? Even we find it difficult to extend our knowledge past the tip of our nose, much less to embrace the universe. There is another factor involved, Peter, than pure intellectual knowledge. And this factor is love. It is reflected in countless avenues of our loving that already extend far beyond our small marriage platform. If it wasn't for this factor, and I mean from the standpoint of statistical probability, said Steve, it is an absolute miracle that we are all still alive in this world that is brimming with 65,000 nuclear bombs, and with financial portfolios that are sheer fantasy in real terms. We live in a world that is supercharged with hypertensions, that is governed by irrational and insane rulers, and in addition is overshadowed with a huge pile of nuclear bombs that are tied into some of the most complex strategic technologies ever invented. We are vulnerable to computer failures, communications failures, sabotage, coercion, even terrorism, and still we survive. It's a miracle, really, that we do. We shouldn't have survived in that environment for as long as we have, certainly not for tens of years. But we did survive, and we still do. So tell me, Peter, how do you define the operating principle of something that can only be seen by its outcome, which we may have consciously created with our real intelligence, that is naturally rooted in the universe, and which totally defy the statistical probabilities that are inherent in a nuclear-armed world? The answer lies in the principle of universal love that serves the needs of the one. I interrupted him. There is evidently still enough love left in the world to power this miracle, but it's fast fading. Isn't it? We may see factors of a higher spiritual quality coming to light in this love that are linked to our spiritual humanity, something that we are not even consciously aware of. It's like we are a part of a qualitatively changing universe that is coming to light in progressive cycles of new forms of life and new capabilities with new potentials. Unfortunately, we are running away from all that. This subject involves questions for which we don't know the answer yet, Peter, said Steve. Still, with all of that considered, we can trust the principles that we already understand. In understanding these principles and their potential, we also understand that we have failed utterly in the past. World War I was allowed to happen, likewise World War II, and every war thereafter. These utter failures should not have happened. We had gone beyond those stages in periods of Renaissance. That we fell back below the Renaissance threshold is a sign of incompetence in living. It is incompetence in living, as human beings, that we are all guilty of. This incompetence must not be allowed to continue. Don't hold your hopes up too high, especially in regard to nuclear war, I said, because we are still sliding backwards into ever greater incompetence. Don't get too comfortable with the fact that nuclear war hasn't happened yet, Steve. The faster we slide into the sewer, the less likely it becomes that our spiritual qualities and spiritual potentials will continue to keep our heads above water. Therefore, my answer to the president must be that he shouldn't panic about the economic crisis. That isn't a real crisis yet. That he should instead be panicking about us all drowning in the sewer that he opened up with his incompetence in leadership. Steve applauded me. The economic crisis, said Steve, isn't big yet, but it will be in the near future. The big crisis today is the unseen crisis of society running headlong in the wrong direction and away from the principle of universal love. It is a crisis of incompetence. The crisis of incompetence is reaching critical levels, added Steve. You must tell the president that the future looks black for as long as he is the captain of this ship, that he's steering into an iceberg field. From a political standpoint, the Soviet Union poses no threat. By what I see happening, the Russian leaders understand the economic reality better than the American president does, which doesn't say much for our president. Also, from the standpoint of the higher-level truth that unites us with one another and with the universe, we appear to be even more secure with a little bit of truth and love that we have still left than the president dares to imagine. Indeed, there is still some love left all over the world, as little as this may be. So tell your president to rein in his horses and keep his missiles at bay. Hysteria is not justified. Tell him that the West will recover quickly from the present glitch in its financial system, even if the system is but a hollow shell. Tell him that the bankers will plug the hole that opened up. They'll do it by hook or by crook, or by all kinds of devious means, but they will recover their system. They will recover their system even if they have to inflate it by printing more and more money. They will do this by these, and by whatever other devious devices that they can think of to recover their system. They will patch this dying thing up, because they don't have anything that they can replace it with, and still survive as an empire. They will keep on with this, because society isn't prepared to take their dying system out of their private hands and scrap it. This lack of universal love in society is also collapsing the Soviet Union from within, I interjected. That will inevitably lead to adventures in nuclear war, such as the Ogorkov plan already spells out. Except the Soviet Union will likely collapse before it gets the resources together to do that. In the West, said Steve, the only alternative that humanity has to its present course of letting the bankers' private control over the world ruin the world is for humanity to rebuild itself on a platform of sovereign nations with national public banks, the world of nations bound in community of principle, cooperating in a constructive manner, focused on mankind's common future. Such a revolution in thinking in the West would also uplift the Soviet Union and save it from its own brand of dark folly. Steve pointed out that no other options really exist. He pointed out that this one option is the only valid option, and not an easy one to implement. While the platform of universal national sovereignty is not being seriously considered anywhere in the world, it cannot be avoided, said Steve. The private imperial bankers won't rescue the world from their obsession with empire, and are not about to allow this essential option to be chosen by society. Society will have to overrule them on that count. That's the impasse that we are facing now. The world is collapsing faster than ever before. In order to get off this train to hell, we will have to discover ourselves as human beings as we have never done before. We must recognize ourselves with that kind of power that gives us the means to simply overrule the past and create a whole new world. Indeed, that's the power that we have as human beings, I said, that unfolds with the principle of universal love. That's what it means to live competently. That's the Samaritan principle. The imperial bankers cannot escape the fact that their rotten domain is fast deteriorating, said Steve, and that the ongoing collapse process will eventually disintegrate their entire system altogether, including whatever power they claim to have. Wouldn't it be better for them to rebuild themselves on a platform of universal principles, the principles that civilization is built on? That would assure their survival, as it would assure also our survival. The critical choice that lies before them, which they are smart enough to see, cannot be avoided by them either. Their system of private financial control over mankind, which has been built up over the last 250 years, cannot be saved by any means, because it is inherently self-destructive. They do know this, but they lack the competence of a normal human being to save themselves from their trap. We must help them in this, which means helping them to shut their failing system down. We are all in the same boat on this planet. I interrupted Steve with laughter. They may not want to be helped. They want to survive, but they don't want to give up their privatization of the wealth of society that they have bullied society to allow. Just wait 20 years, said Steve, and there won't be anything left of what we have today, together with the people that our civilization is supporting today. Who needs to wait 20 years? I interrupted Steve. The fact is, our economy, our culture, our financial system, our education system, our transportation system, our healthcare system are all empty shells already. What we once had as a nation is already gone. We've become an empty shell ourselves, filled with poverty within. That empty shell cannot be saved, Peter. Only the nation that is still alive to some degree can be saved. It can be saved by shutting the private bankers' disintegrating process down that has hollowed out our nation, which are but branches of empire. Nothing can be saved without shutting down empire itself, globally. Thereby the bankers themselves might be saved. And in order to shut down empire, we need to rebuild our social foundation, our marriage system, that has isolated the whole of mankind so deeply that empire has found a fertile ground to root itself into the empty spaces that our universal isolation has created. And for this isolation to disappear, we have to bring the principle of the general welfare into the social domain, starting with the Great Renaissance principle of 1648, the principle of the advantage of the other. This means that we must uplift our marriage system from being an isolating platform into becoming a platform that reflects the already existing reality of our universal marriage as human beings. And for this there is no mold possible that society can cast itself into. The moment we look to the universe for a model to set a stage for the complementary attraction to one another as human beings with a wide range of polarities, we find a near infinite range of models for this attraction to unfold. For any form of social unity that you can possibly imagine in your wildest dreams, Peter, an operational model likely already exists somewhere in the universe, which adds to its grandeur and its power. This infinite option is the option before us. It's the only option worth considering. Nothing less will ever be sufficient to vacate empire from the planet and give us the power to create the needed Ice Age Renaissance. This option should be chosen today, Peter, before things get still worse. It should be chosen now, not 20 years, From now, when the global house is coming down in the wake of the continuing destruction, just as the needed Ice Age Renaissance should be started now to create the infrastructures that we require to survive 100 years in the future. We should have started with this 100 years ago, before we got into the current mess, where the entire political and economic geometry is changing towards an end phase that we ultimately cannot survive. The turning point has to be now. This is what you must tell your boss. The recognizing of this turning point is the most critical choice before humanity today. Anything else is secondary. Firing a president who has gone so insane that he's thinking of nuclear war is not the real solution. It's nothing more than a secondary, emergency, band-aid measure, as critical as it is for it to be implemented. You must fight for this, and not leave the real option out of sight. You must fight for the real solution just as intensively, because that's where the principles are found that also give you the power to implement the emergency measures. This is why it is true, Peter, that the needs of the one outweigh the needs of many, because the needs of the many cannot be met without the principles that meet the needs of the one, where the real solution unfolds. Without these principles, the Ice Age Renaissance cannot be created, and 99% of mankind will die of the consequences. Is it really necessary to always draw the focus back to the Ice Age and the needed Renaissance that we must build for it, which we will never see in our lifetime? I interrupted Steve. Don't we have enough critical problems to focus on? Steve shook his head. The Ice Age focus is needed, because until now all the other critical problems haven't moved us. We need a shock front. Even the potential for a nuclear war hasn't moved us sufficiently to get us out of our easy chair, where we while away the hours and days and years, and nothing gets done. A shock front? I repeated. Yes, we need something explosive that will wake society up. We need something bigger than an alarm clock, Peter. Look at the textile industry in America. It was exported to the slavery world of foreign sweatshops. Nobody cared. Society let it happen. It said it wasn't a big thing. Then the same happened with the shoe industry. Society looked at it and said that we can live with that. Consequently, nothing was done to reverse the trend. Then the same happened to the steel industry. Well, society said in those days that it can tolerate the loss of the steel industry, too. But the reality is that we can't tolerate any of that. When the textile industry died in America, the nation began to die, imperceptibly at first. But it began to die. Soon the dying accelerated. Now we face a future in which our entire automobile industry will be on the block, and our aircraft industry, and our machine tool industry, and then our farming. The Ice Age focus is truly needed, Peter, because it tells us that we can't live with any of that crap. The future economic task is too great to be messed around with, as we have done until now. The survival of the nation has been put at risk. In the future, it will be the survival of mankind that is at risk. The Ice Age focus is needed, as it might impel us to put our nose back into the real world, the world of universal principles that we cannot ignore without consequences. The Ice Age focus is needed because the Ice Age consequences are potentially universally fatal if we don't get real. By bringing the Ice Age into the equation, we are forced to shift our paradigms back to reality. We need something big as a motivator to get us out of the easy chair. Something that is as large as the Ice Age challenge might just fit the bill. We need a big bang for an alarm clock because we've been asleep for too long. We need it badly, and we need it now, because in our slumber we are drifting invariably in the wrong direction towards a quadruple crisis. And don't think for one single second that an unfolding Ice Age Renaissance wouldn't have immediate benefits right around the world. On this path we would develop the technological power almost immediately to provide free high-quality houses, by the millions for anyone in need. Nuclear power and high-temperature processes utilizing basalt, applied to automated industrial production, would enable us to do this almost immediately. We would also build floating bridges linking the continents across the oceans, which would in addition serve as links to floating agriculture extending deep across the tropics. we would eradicate homelessness almost instantly that way, and slum living, unemployment, poverty, hunger, and of course also war. All of this could be accomplished in less than a decade, long before we would even begin to develop large-scale indoor agriculture. We would even develop the space technology to go to Mars, to use Mars as a research facility where we encounter stronger cosmic ray intensity. On this path we would give the biosphere a greater potential for development than it has here on Earth, which we would also benefit from. This would certainly qualify as a big bang that shakes the world and wakes society up. I interjected. Steve just laughed. Have you forgotten what I told you earlier? He said. We can do all of these things, but we can't create any of that on our old social marriage platform that is universally isolating mankind, not to mention the circumcision that has robbed a people of their innermost humanity, by which people became even more isolated. The complementary attraction of mankind to each other has a deep sexual root that is extensively nourished by our sexual sensitivity. Wherever the circumcision is encountered that inhibits the sexual attraction, it treks society's already deeply isolating marriage system still further. When the circumcision reaches past a certain threshold, the entire social structure becomes wrecked thereby. In our precious USA, Peter, the circumcision has mutilated over 90% in some age groups, which makes it almost impossible for the women in this group to have an enriching relationship with a normal man, because those have become extremely rare. And there is a difference, a huge difference, Peter. I challenge you to list the major nations of the world that have remained largely untouched by the circumcision that disables the normal development of a human being and a human society as a whole and its civilization. When you want to revitalize the world, you have to begin with the few remaining unmutilated societies that are the least damaged, and then launch a huge effort to develop that resource that still exists. America doesn't fall into this category. It has destroyed itself too deeply. This means that an additional healing has to be accomplished, for which the models and social infrastructures need yet to be developed. Alright, this puts China onto the top of the list, with the largest population in the world and no circumcision, I said to Steve. Steve motioned me to go on. Equally high on the list might be India, the second largest nation, with also no circumcision, possibly because of its Hindu tradition, I said cautiously. And also Russia qualifies to some degree. Its population is comparatively small, but Russia's territory is large, and so are its natural resources. Its Orthodox Christian background, and its deep ties to Mother Russia, appears to have kept the door closed to the circumcision in spite of the Jewish and Islamic infiltration. This leaves essentially only Russia to some degree, and China and India at the starting gate, and a few smaller nations whose men haven't been mutilated yet, like the Japanese, North Koreans, Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians, Burmese, Thais, Mexicans, and almost all the men in South America and in quite a few European nations. Of all the advanced great nations of the world, America has been the hardest hit, and Canada likewise, where the greatest efforts are needed for healing. And where the Ice Age will have its greatest initial impact, if the world remains unprepared for it. Right, Peter, said Steve. That's where the Big Bang will come from. When the three power blocks, Russia, China, and India, where the men have remained unmutilated, were to unite in cooperative development, they would bring together the largest single block of the world's undamaged humanity. The most natural partner to join them would be the USA. That's why the USA has been disabled by the masters of empire, with the coerced introduction of the circumcision in the post-American period, the post-FDR period, Peter. The USA has the tallest constitution, the longest history of freedom from empire, the greatest industrial power, and a cultural background with an unlimited economic potential. But America's social structure was still too weak to prevent empire from taking root in its background. And so, the masters of empire destroyed the nation once more, from within, by promoting the circumcision after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Nevertheless, America still qualifies as a potential world power because 30% of its total male population has remained uncircumcised. America isn't yet the Samson, Peter, who has been shorn completely of its strength. Sure, 70% of its male population has been disabled, which is tragic of course, but those 30% who remain whole represent a functioning majority. A disabled society, no matter how big in numbers it might be, doesn't amount to much, which renders the small faction that has remained whole a majority. The development power in America will flow from those who have remained whole. A cooperative treaty union of America, Russia, China, and India is still possible. If this becomes implemented, it will become the Big Bang that will shake the world and shut down all the structures of empire on our planet once and for all. On this four-power treaty platform, the horizon will be open wide enough for the needed Ice Age Renaissance to come into view. Then, and only then, will every nation have a future. If society fails in this, it faces not only the loss of the potentially brightest Renaissance in world history, which it will then never see, but will experience instead a quadruple crisis that no one can survive. A quadruple crisis? I repeated. Sure, Pete. Number 1, we are moving towards a physical economic disintegration right now, on a near global scale, with a collapse happening of an unimaginable magnitude, and with absolutely devastating consequences, coupled with a corresponding political disintegration. Number 2, we are moving towards the deepest financial collapse that has ever happened on this planet. Number 3, we are on the high-speed train towards nuclear war. The strain is not rushing towards survival, but away from it, towards preemption, the preemption of human life. Number 4, we are facing the possible loss of 99% of the world's agriculture in 100 years' time with the return of the Ice Age, if not sooner. Would you say that what we see happening in the world today is a competent response to any one of these great challenges that are greater than any we ever had to face in the entire history of mankind? The challenge is so big that nobody can even imagine a solution, I interjected, definitely not in America. Now, can you see why we must get a treaty alliance established between China, Russia, India, and the USA, to combine what's left of a humanity that hasn't had a deeply critical element of its humanity amputated that is vital for a well-functioning civilization? Said Steve. In this you find your measurement for competence in selecting a new president or installing a de facto president. Anyone who is not fully committed to the four-power treaty alliance as a platform for saving civilization, the nations, and mankind as a whole is not fit for the office of the president. Right now, the U.S. president is far from qualified. And that's where the real challenge lies. Will the 30% of the U.S. population that has remained whole, who are its potential giants, take the initiative to bring the coal issue into the open, which is the only platform on which civilization can be rescued? The 70% of America's men who had a deep-reaching element of their humanity amputated are by their victimization inclined to play the role of obedient slaves to the money bags of empire and are inclined to play their games. The bags have put them into positions of great power, including the presidency. Your task, Peter, is to overrule them all and to outweigh them. For this to be possible, you need to see yourself as the majority. You can do this by raising the rule of principle so high that the traitors will resign at their own accord. Right now the traitors are honored. They are honored for the wealth they gain by being on the take. This needs to change. And it will change. All you need to do is uplift the social platform to something more real and natural, where people are no longer isolated. I shook my head quietly. Steve laughed. There you have it, Peter. If the president and those who own him want my honest advice, tell them that he and his entire court must resign, and society must appoint someone who is competent to do the great job that needs to be done in the present period, the period of the unfolding quadruple crisis. Tell him that the future crisis that we are moving towards threatens to become the most severe crisis for humanity since the dawn of man, with unimaginable consequences in the wings. Tell him to look for someone like me. Tell him that a sane person needs to be at the helm to steer the ship in these extraordinary times ahead. Tell him that he is too little a man and doesn't qualify by a long shot under the current criterion. Anybody who toys with preemptive nuclear first strike scenarios and plays silly political games while ignoring that the economy is collapsing financially and physically is insane and has no right to have the authority of the high office of the President of the United States of America. Any man who holds on to this post and is incompetent is a traitor to his country and to humanity. He should be honest enough with himself and vacate the office. Or failing that, he should be asked to vacate it, or be removed by impeachment, or by public demand, or through a recall vote, or... I get what you're saying, Steve, I interrupted him. But you are dreaming. Steve, as I said before, that will never happen. No president has ever resigned his office for reasons of incompetence. Nor has anyone ever been impeached for this reason. And as for a recall, no laws exist. Then you are dreaming. Peter, when you think that the USA and humanity will survive without those steps being taken, and I mean all of them, the political steps and the social steps. There is a first time for everything, Peter. But if you say that this won't happen, then we have already lost. Of course, the reason why the president hasn't been impeached already for his incompetence, or anyone before him, reflects the simple fact that society has become insane and incompetent too. Society thinks itself to be zoo animals. At least it behaves that way. That's insanity, and insanity is incompetence too. It is supreme incompetence. And this is why modern society is failing. Society must be deemed insane, since it allows what is happening today. If the laws don't exist to get an incompetent president removed, or any other leader in the world who fits the description, then create the laws. Society is made up of human beings, and human beings have the capacity to do this. One way or another, this has got to be done to save the nation and nations, and civilization, if not all life on this planet. That is how critical this thing is trending to become in the near future. So do it, Peter. In any case, the man who you call your president should have never been elected to the White House in the first place. Still, it has happened. So you see, Peter, the impossible has already happened in America. He began to laugh. So let's turn this thing around and make sure that what appears even more impossible today, namely the healing of society and the creating of a new renaissance, does happen just as well. Here Steve stopped and began to laugh some more. So you see, Peter, America truly is the land of the impossible coming true. The fact is, the President of the United States of America is not by design an elected dictator, but is a hired servant who has a job to do. His job is to assure that the community of principle that is laid out in the Constitution, which to some degree reflects the unity of mankind, is never violated, or ignored, or forgotten. This is the leading edge of statecraft. He has to take the lead in defending the fundamental principles that are founded on the principle of universal love, such as the principle of the general welfare. His job is to promote the development of love. This is an extremely demanding job, and there are actually few contenders in the present world that qualify. There should be a rigorous screening process established with high standards for electing a president, especially now as so few qualify, and so much is riding on the ticket. You imply that the prospective applicant must understand the principle of universal love, I interrupted Steve. Who even knows that this principle exists? Our present president-elect would take it as an insult if I were to demand this of him. He sees himself as a tough guy, a strong leader riding on a ticket of unyielding resolve to use force. He is a Hobbesian hero. No love is allowed to interfere in his administration. Too few people are qualified to take on this high job, said Steve, and so they fail. They fail because society fails itself. Society fails because it doesn't know what love is. Consequently, the nation suffers from this universal incompetence. This means that society first and foremost must know the principle of universal love. If it did, its institutions would reflect that. In order to be able to fulfill his role as the universal screening agent in selecting its supreme servant, society requires a broad accomplishment in living in accord with this principle. And so I have to say it again, as I said it many times before, the development of the principle of universal love in society must begin at the grassroots level. It is not good enough that nothing is happening at the grassroots level. The world is in great danger because of this lack. That is why the USA hasn't had a competent president, except on rare occasions, because nothing is moving there, at the grassroots level, towards the principle of universal love. If society is blind to this principle, I interjected, then who is left to rally the government around the general welfare principle that is rooted in the principle of universal love? Who will rally the government around the cornerstone of the nation's constitution that reflects this principle? Steve shrugged his shoulders. There's no one home, he said, and laughed. That's why it happened only on rare occasions that the American people elected a president that was actually qualified to do the job. Are you surprised? And the reason for this tragedy is that the people themselves don't understand their role in the process of civilization and haven't for a long time, and also their responsibility towards each other and towards humanity. This role involves upholding the principle of universal love. Society doesn't understand yet the inseparable unity of humanity in which their lives unfold, where love plays an immensely greater role than they have ever imagined. Consequently, by being blind to their role as human beings, they don't give a damn about what they do. In the end, they complain bitterly when the clowns they elect don't fulfill their duty and take on the role of a king. That's why America hasn't had a real president for decades, I interjected. The people elect someone who assumes that he has been chosen as their king, rather than their supreme servant. Nevertheless, society can't escape the consequences of its folly, and those consequences are getting bigger, said Steve. Here Steve laughed again. The president is scared of the Russians, he said. He should be scared of himself. I am scared of him. I'm scared of what his insanity might drag us into. I am scared of the American people who allow this to happen. That's what you must tell the president for me, Peter. He asked for my opinion on the present danger. That is my opinion, and more than that, it is the truth. Tell him to do the one honest thing a person can do under the circumstances, and resign for reasons of stupidity. I stood up and shook my head, ready to leave. You are asking the impossible, I said. Steve just smiled and motioned me to sit down again. I've only been telling you what must be done. This is indisputable. Now, let's look at the technical aspects, if you are interested. Steve put his newspaper down and produced a couple of sandwiches from his brown paper bag, each one separately wrapped. He offered one to me, loaded with German sausage and sauerkraut. So, the technical issues, he repeated after we had eaten half a sandwich. As I said, we are not in a state of economic crisis yet, but we are in a much bigger crisis in other respects. Yes, Pete, the technical issue is that nobody knows anymore what their job is. Incompetent people that call themselves geniuses, and not just in government, run the USA. I see the same happening all over the world at all levels of society, especially in the sciences. They ignore the fundamental unity that exists in the natural world, and then force the world to move against that. Thus, they create chaos. Steve explained that in the world of finance and economics, the financial aggregates have become isolated from the physical economy, from which they have been stolen, so that both elements are undergoing a collapse, and dramatically so, more than what is apparent on the surface. The two elements, finance and economics, simply cannot exist in isolation, said Steve. Why can't anybody understand this simple fact? Financial wealth means nothing without a corresponding equivalent in physical wealth reflected in productive processes. If nothing is produced, society is poor, and may starve to death no matter how much money it has stashed away. Steve said that the book value of stocks, bonds, currencies, and derivative instruments has been increasing astronomically, This has created an illusion of skyrocketing wealth, while the opposite is true. The physical economy, which the financial aggregates are a claim against, is rapidly collapsing under the ever-increasing pressures of stealing and looting and slavery. Instead of creating wealth, the present system is creating debt and poverty. The imperial system has always created debt and poverty for as long as this system existed, I interjected, hasn't it? Steve nodded. Don't forget, Peter, that now in the age of automated processes and hyperactive insanity, the destructive processes that create the debt and poverty are carried out more efficiently. This trend, all by itself, should be seen as a greater crisis than the few ripples on the financial markets that the president is worried about. The steep-moving trend threatens to collapse civilization. This unfolding tragedy has been especially prevalent since the days when the modern phase shift began. The dramatic escalation of insanity was unleashed in 1951 with the CIA's Congress of Cultural Freedom. It began when the floodgates were opened to the sewer of imperial cultural warfare. Steve turned to me with a serious look as he said this. People assume that the processes that America got into were chosen for the benefit of America. That's a tragic error. From the day the American Republic was born, it has been a thorn in the eyes of the imperials. The imperials have therefore tried to destroy it by every means possible and have not ceased in their effort. That's the Venetian method, Peter, the same method the Venetians have used in their effort to destroy the Renaissance in Europe. Ever since the Venetians invaded England, that method has been applied against the whole world, especially against America, that was built on the achievements of the Great European Renaissance. The Great European Renaissance itself was rooted in the achievements of the Greek classical culture, pioneered by Homer, by the Pythagorean society, and by Solon of Athens. This early cultural spark that gave a profound face to civilization was immediately threatened by the forces of empire and almost eradicated by the Peloponnesian War. But it was revived again and became advanced by the efforts of Socrates and Plato after the Peloponnesian War had run its course. Then, virtually before the ink was dry on the paper of cultural development, Rome nearly destroyed it again. The Islamic Renaissance that emerged out of the cultural wasteland that Rome left behind played a critical role in later years in bringing the Greek cultural revival, especially Plato and Socrates, back into Europe. The Golden Renaissance emerged from this. It ended the Dark Age in Europe that the Venetians had intentionally maintained in concert with Norman chivalry. Ironically, the Dark Age condition in Europe ended when the European economy collapsed, and the financial empires collapsed with it. Plato was brought back, and was revived. The revival created the Golden Renaissance, and every Renaissance thereafter. The American Republic was built on this background, and was modeled after Plato's Republic. It represented the pinnacle in the cultural achievement of mankind that had been carried forward through many ages. The American Republic was also seen as a mortal threat by every empire that ever was, especially by the British/Venetian/liberal empire that had by then achieved a near universal liberty in stealing from society worldwide. Indeed, the American spirit represented not an idle threat to the British Empire, which is our republic's chief opponent ever since it was born. The American threat to the empire was especially felt in the late 1800s, when the American model for economic development and its focus on the general welfare was becoming emulated all over the world. The idea caught on in Russia, in South America, in Japan, with interest also developing in China. World War I was instigated by the British Empire as a means to stop the advancing spirit of the American Renaissance from taking over the world. Hitler was quickly financed into power by the imperials to finish the job that the Venetians had started centuries earlier of destroying the apparently endlessly unfolding spirit of Renaissance. And Hitler, too, did his job well that he was hired for. Much of the world was destroyed by the fascism that he represented. Only the American Republic itself had survived the destructive chaos of the fascist plague. However, as soon as the imperials had regained their footing, after Hitler had done his thing, and then killed himself, America was no longer needed to defend the empire. Consequently, America became the imperial target once again. It became immediately infiltrated to be destroyed from within. Truman opened the floodgates for America to become the next fascist state. The nation became subjected from this point on to the most deeply reaching cultural warfare effort ever unleashed against a people. The cultural warfare campaign became so successful that we destroyed our own industries, our own culture, our own infrastructures, our farming, our healthcare system, and even our education system. We are today a defeated nation, Peter. We've been brought to our knees by a cultural warfare effort that our nation didn't even recognize was unleashed against it, which society was embracing, rather than defending itself against. We were asleep then, I interrupted Steve, and in our slumber we abetted the enemy. We became the champion of the post-industrial society dogma that transformed us into the no-future society that we have become. Steve shook his head. It began long before that. It began when our people were put asleep with the imperial shock and fear therapy. We were put to sleep so deeply that the whole society became underlings to the creeping morass of empire that corrupts the very soul. However, Peter, this evil wasn't born on our American shores. When I entered the academic world in America, the fascist shock had already spread across the whole background. The human being had already been tarred as a cancer upon the earth. And that was just the beginning. Peter. While America slumbered, wrapped up in New Age dreams, there was evil brewing in the halls of empire, the kind of evil that does not sleep. There was evil so black that it reduced the image of humanity into a barren wasteland, in which it drowned all hopes, in a sea of dust and ashes. Dust and ashes were the metaphor applied to the value of humanity. That metaphor ushered in the years of the depopulation demands. The imperial goal was to reduce the world population to 1 or 2 billion people. America became the chief voice in this song of intent for genocide, but the song itself was not written in America. Genocide isn't in the background of our American culture. The song of genocide was written in the far-off hidden halls of empire, where the very air was, and still is, thick within humanity, like a poisonous fume that echoes the poison pens of imperial pioneers, like those that had hoped for a new black plague to sweep the world, or a particularly deadly virus that one of the imperials had hoped to become himself in another life. In this deadly environment, America declared its intent to target third world nations for depopulation by genocide through what it called natural means, meaning death by poverty, death by diseases, and then set the process in motion. Africa, however, unwittingly, became the chief target of the game and unleashed. The stated goal was to prevent the development of the third world nations so that their natural resources might be preserved for the empire's future needs. But it didn't stop there. America became subjected to the same game. I shook my head, though I knew that he was right. And that tragedy, Peter, was also just another beginning. The evil that came out of those dark halls of empire is still on the move, like an untiring rage that creeps without slumber while the world remains asleep. There was one man, however, who understood this creeping evil, said Steve. He had seen this evil even before it arose, and had poisoned the modern world. He had been privileged to some degree to have access to the imperial circles of power that were brooding this evil behind their closed doors. The man's name is Tolkien. He described the empire by its effect in his writings, where he named it murder. Steve paused, as if he was searching for a link back to the present. That is how you must judge what you see happening in America today, he said after a long silence. What you see happening is the result of a clearly coordinated effort to achieve the most detrimental effect that a nation can be subjected to. Russia is targeted in the same manner. Both nations are targeted by the imperials out of fear that one or both might embrace once more the profound American Renaissance that both had seen in action during the war years. It seems to me that Russia is more resistant to cultural warfare than we are, I said. That might be because of their much longer exposure to it. Nevertheless, Russia is like America, a defeated nation, said Steve. Russia has been a defeated nation ever since it accepted the British Empire's Trojan horse at the hand of Karl Marx, the bearer of the gift of communism. We are now entering an era of great instability in which both of the hollowed out and destroyed nations and their institutions cease to function. We may soon come to the point when civilization is beginning to disintegrate. Actually, the term disintegrate is too mild to describe what is already happening. As we move deeper into the sewer, especially in the financial arena, I interrupted Steve. The world financial system is fast becoming a sleazy casino. Hundreds of billions are now riding the dice every single day. We see blue chip giants losing their shirt in this casino-driven world, where physical production doesn't count for anything anymore. And that's how it is meant to be, said Steve. When you see America's blue chip giants losing their credit trading in the imperial court of money bags, you can bet this is a coordinated effort in bringing the nation further to its knees, rather than to enrich it. And the real target is always the society at large. It always is. Do you know what it means to society when one of its blue chip giants, that was once deemed as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar, gets downgraded to junk bond status? It means that all the pension funds that aren't allowed to hold junk bonds must sell their core assets at deep discounts just to get rid of them, which the vultures then snap up for a song. This, all by itself, will unravel the whole imaginary value system if it continues unchecked. In addition, America, and with it much of the Western world, is deeply locked into the imperial's financial derivatives casinos, where the gambling is 1,000 times bigger than the physical economy. What we have happening there, in comparative terms, is a flea bite killing an elephant. The flea bite is the intentionally created financial insanity built on the cultural warfare efforts that America has been subjected to. America, the giant, refusing to defend itself, consequently dies. The flea bite could also represent what we are going to unleash against the Imperial's empire to bring their house down, I said to Steve moments later, and began to laugh. If we can inject into this insane world a faint sense of reality, it could have the potential of causing huge ripples that will take down the entire financial fairy tale bubble, though it may be the biggest bubble of all times. Don't dream, Peter, said Steve. What you propose has never happened before. We are moving towards our self-destruction with breathtaking speed, and with an absolute resolve to see this through. Of course, if you are serious instead of dreaming and are willing to devote yourself to actually doing what you are talking about, then great wonders are possible. So, we face a paradox then, I said to Steve. But why shouldn't we do this? The key to doing it is to pour flood tides of love onto the human scene. If love is a universal principle, and empire is but the darkness of a void, why shouldn't the principle of universal love enable us to illumine the dark void of empire with the light of our love as human beings? Steve changed the subject. Technically, one always ends up with a paradox, Pete, when one separates two elements that are inseparable by their very nature, like separating the world of finance from the physical economy. One ends up lying to oneself by splitting apart what is inherently one, creating a world of illusions that will eventually cause one to destroy everything that one has built, if not society altogether. But you are right, Peter, it doesn't have to come to the bitter end. The trend can be arrested. Love as a principle can cause people to step away from their tradition and stealing from one another, and from looting the poor through slavery. Another paradox is that this tragedy can be rather easily prevented, while nobody cares enough to do it, I added. Steve nodded. He said that he continues to be amazed that everybody still clings to these insanely created illusions as to what the wealth of society is, since these illusions have been created to destroy society's real wealth. Steve suggested that it should be obvious to everyone by now that it doesn't really matter whether the financial aggregates that people hold in their portfolios are measured in trillions of dollars, or in hundreds of trillions, or in thousands of trillions of dollars. If the physical economy is worth next to nothing in terms of its wealth-producing capacity for enriching society that the financial aggregates are a claim against, then all the financial aggregates in the world are likewise worth next to nothing. The simple reason for this is that nothing is being produced when the physical economy is collapsing that the financial aggregates could buy. Thereby, most of the laid-up aggregates have already become meaningless. In real terms, they have become worthless. Steve added quietly that this collapse towards nothing is already happening almost universally. The countdown has begun, he said. The train has left the station. It's rolling. If it isn't stopped, we can kiss our chances for an Ice Age renaissance goodbye. In order to be able to survive the Ice Age transition, we will have to enter the Ice Age, with the most powerful economy imaginable, an economy that has the capacity to put 99% of the world's agriculture into indoor facilities in 100 years' time. For this, we need to change our perception about what an economy is and what wealth is. We have to scrap the notion of creating millionaires and billionaires, to say nothing about trillionaires, as we may have someday soon, who are people that have become spectacularly successful in stealing from society and destroying people's living. What we've come to call wealth in the modern world bears the face of fascism. We have to turn this around. We have to create a sense of economy that enables all people to live and to live richly productive lives, both in terms of enriching society for the universal good and in terms of people's own living and their development as human beings that unfolds into happiness. We need to develop universal wealth by unlocking the human potential, not privatized wealth that kills the human potential. We must do this because this universal wealth is needed to upgrade the physical landscape of the global economy to such a point that indoor agriculture can be created as a side product while society's increasing needs are also being met. No more than 10% of the economic product of society can be devoted to this goal of creating indoor agriculture, no matter how urgent it is, or else we won't reach the goal at all. We need to create brand new cities designed for efficient living. We need those new cities in order to develop the creative and productive potential that enables mankind as a whole to meet the Ice Age challenge. Without this kind of ever-growing universal investment into ourselves as human beings rather than as slaves, the necessary productive environment cannot be created. Therefore, we need to create a hyper-productive environment that is comparable to the thermal energy level of a plasma environment in physics. Nothing less will be sufficient in preparation for the coming Ice Age transition. Steve paused and took another bite from his sandwich. Tell this to your president and see if he can understand any of it. But mostly tell this to the American people who have elected a whole train of brain-dead presidents for decades that have all become fascist in their stupidity. If we can't get America out of its present trap, as America represents the tallest cultural achievement of mankind, we can kiss civilization goodbye. If America fails, Europe won't have a hope in hell, and less so, the rest of mankind. In fact, humanity has very little left in that qualifies for the term humanity. In this void we kiss mankind goodbye, once the Ice Age begins, especially our children. And their children, unless they can manage to live without food. I raised my hand to stop him. No, Peter. Just imagine this, all of Canada was once buried miles deep under an ice sheet during the last Ice Age, together with the US Northeast, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Ireland, England, Poland, and most of Russia, all the way south to past Kiev. While these vast areas won't be instantly covered in ice, their agriculture will likely be wiped out quite early in the transition period. It won't take long then until there won't be enough left of the current agricultural system to support more than 100 million people worldwide. Unfortunately, that won't cover more than 1% of the population, and even that is still 10 to 100 times bigger than the world population that emerged from the last Ice Age. That's the situation your grandchildren, or their children, will be forced to face, Peter, if we don't act now. The critical point of decision is now. So it all becomes a moral question then, Steve. Competent living is a moral question, Peter. Our responsibility as human beings extends forward in time even past our own children, to our children's children, and their children. We have to flood the whole horizon with our love, fully backed up with deeds, starting now. All of that becomes critical for meeting the Ice Age challenge. As I said, we are entering a new geometry, and that covers all fields, not just politics and economics. It extends into physics, science, our humanity, and our love, even time. In real terms, it's always been the human way to extend our love, to embrace future generations. Only now that becomes imperative. Competent living has become imperative. Sylvia and I don't even have any children, I said quietly. Neither do we, Pete, but that doesn't change anything. All children are our children, the children of our common humanity. She and I have explored this in Cozumel to great depth, Steve. Did she tell you about it? Steve nodded. That's the point, Peter. We are not heading that way. Instead of heading that way and regarding all children of our universal humanity as our children, and this with the same care we would devote to our personal child, we stand still and allow ourselves to be doomed. For the vast task before us to be accomplished, we have to create a world of super intense universal wealth. However, instead of doing that, we are heading in the direction of a zero wealth disaster, Pete. I suggest that instead of kissing our children and their children goodbye, we should kiss the notion of privatized financial wealth goodbye, including the my property syndrome that has become the chief counterproductive, counter-economic, counter-humanist, fascist element that ever was, that robs society of its humanity. Right now, said Steve, the illusion of financial wealth can still be maintained by the manipulators through increased stealing and ever more daring emergency measures, such as printing more money to cover the deficits in the dying system. In the flare-out zone, however, when the financial illusions and the collapsing physical reality become ever more widely separated from each other, which we may reach in a decade or two, the fundamental lie, which rules the world today, built on stolen wealth, will fall apart. Unfortunately, if the trend is not reversed, society will fall apart with it. By then, when the physical collapse is in progress, it may be too late to turn the ship around towards the needed Ice Age renaissance. It's physically impossible to build a grand renaissance on barren ground, and in short order. Steve pointed out that the ongoing physical collapse and the collapse of the so-called financial wealth are by their nature so tightly interlocked that both systems will disintegrate simultaneously, with consequences that cannot be imagined, and he added that the consequences would be worse if society fell in this collapse onto barren ground. If you treat the physical and the financial elements of an economy, which are elements of a single principle, in isolation, and apply different principles for each, then the whole thing that you create that way eventually disintegrates into nothing, like a soap bubble pops, said Steve. He suggested that every competent scientist should know this. I agreed. We know this, I said. Nor does the apparent lack of understanding in the world alter the principle of society's inseparable unity. Our failure in perception doesn't change the nature of our humanity, I said. What we, that is you and I, understand, everybody is able to understand. Of course, it doesn't change the underlying principle, Pete. Still, society can't be lax about it. We are all in the same boat together. We can't afford to lose the ship. The people in Germany found this out the hard way under Hitler. Their collective insanity, no matter who created it, was eventually reflected in their collective tragedy. Millions of people that were shouting proudly, "Heil Hitler," ended up bleeding to death in the ditches of Russia. Some of them may have recognized that Hitler was criminally insane, but they have said to themselves, "This doesn't affect me, I can work around that." Well, they couldn't work around the principle they ignored and escape the loss of its effect. Universal tragedies occur when people lose their focus on the principle of universal love and drift into utopian dreaming, where nothing is real. But did the German people really have the option to overturn Hitler? I interjected. The Nazis had the whole nation captivated with Goebbels' propaganda machine. I think the German people, in spite of their high culture, lack the spiritual resources within them to rescue themselves from this trap. That's hogwash, Peter. Steve protested. That's a cheap excuse, and you know it. Let's look at the facts, Peter. The German people had the greatest principles ever created, developed right in their midst. The Treaty of Westphalia, for example, which became the foundation for modern civilization, was a part of Germany's cultural heritage, including its underlying Renaissance principle, the principle of the advantage of the other. That principle had become a part of German culture. It had come closer to reflecting the principle of universal love than any principle ever had. However, society didn't care enough to hold on to it. If society had kept these principles rooted in their heart and soul, especially at the grassroots level, thereby creating a nation of Samaritans, then Joseph Goebbels would have achieved nothing with his clown tricks. He would have stood powerless. So, don't put all the blame on Goebbels. He only worked with what had been handed to him on a silver platter. Steve smiled and nodded. That's how we must approach the Ice Age today, he continued quietly. People are dreaming this wonderful dream, that the reality doesn't affect them, but in the end it does. The fact is that we can't ignore the principle of universal love, or any of its countless natural reflections. This fact is especially profound in economics, where the principle of universal love is fundamental to everything. We need a vibrantly productive economy, the kind of economy in which the financial aggregates are focused exclusively on the continuing increase of the power of human labor throughout the entire system. When this happens, the economic process becomes secure, said Steve. Society may legalize stealing in a big way, as it presently does, in order that huge profits may be garnered in the financial gambling casinos where nothing of value is being produced for society. But, Peter, even this most pompous artificial legitimacy of stealing from one another doesn't alter the fact that no legislation, no matter how strongly it is supported, can change the universal principles that are thereby being ignored. That is why the entire present system is doomed to collapse and to disintegrate. We simply cannot overrule universal principles with the arrogance of will or legislation. I began to laugh and applaud him. Steve reached his hand out and began to laugh too. I see, we understand each other, he said. If only more people would join us, many great tragedies would be avoided. The present level of insanity is scary, that society has drifted into, as people began to separate the unity between financial wealth and physical production. They are spitting into the face of the fundamental principles and then complain about the consequences, said Steve, and began to laugh too. What is happening today is like people jumping into the ocean, expecting not to get wet, then complaining bitterly when they do get wet, I said. Suddenly they realize that they are drowning. That's the kind of insanity that we see today, Peter, which has never been seen nor experienced before on our planet with the intensity that we are experiencing now. And if this isn't scary enough for you, consider that the trend has just begun. It's more than scary, I interjected. It's a crying shame. The current trend is the end product of decades of cultural warfare that has been unleashed to keep the looting financial empires alive. People are dying rather than fighting back. Society has been dragged into this dream of pleasant illusions. The Imperials are caught up in this dream themselves, said Steve. This dream is now destroying their empires and their existence likewise, and more rapidly perhaps than an advancing civilization would have. That's how clever they are, Steve. Paradoxically, what people can no longer recognize in their convoluted thinking has been clearly understood more than 2,000 years ago when it was said that a house divided against itself cannot stand, said Steve. The insanity of our president is nothing more than just a symptom of society's own trend as it is sleepwalking ever deeper into the sewer of insanity. The reality of the ancient statement can no longer be ignored. Society is divided against itself, and it finds ever more that it cannot stand. Nor has this tragedy been experienced as intensely and tragically on a global scale before, as we are beginning to experience it, and as we may die from it in the not-too-distant future. Steve paused for a moment, then nodded. That's more or less what comes out of Russia too, according to everyone I know there. They are fully aware that a major catastrophe is in the making in the West. LaRouche has made this amply clear. They also know that this tragedy is getting worse for as long as insanity rules and is allowed to continue to rule. They see this phenomenon happening in their own backyard. The Russians are scared, Peter, but they also know that humanity has a few years' grace left, not long, but enough to get its act together. They are struggling to find a way to do this, but their hands are tied. The Western Emporium has them in their grasp. The Soviets are fully aware that the current tremors in the Western markets are telltale fluctuations, but they laugh about what they see. Some laugh with glee, sensing that the Western system is doomed, though they don't know why. They certainly don't know that they are caught in the same trap. In fact, they are hoping that the West will disintegrate in the future, and they are preparing a military campaign to take advantage of this total collapse when it happens. But they also know that the time for that hasn't come. Nor do they fully realize that their own system is even more deeply doomed than the West is doomed, and for similar reasons. They assume that cleverly applied emergency measures can fix the symptoms temporarily, which they do not want to see. They see no reason, therefore, to start a war over what is happening now, but are inclined to wait. However, as I said before, the masters of empire are pulling many strings and own many dancing puppets who may pull off the unexpected. This means that while we are living in the shadow of empire, nobody can be secure. Security begins when the history of empire ends. And this gets us back to your president, who is one of the dancing puppets on their strings. It also gets us back to the leaking dam syndrome, I interrupted Steve. Whenever a leak begins to form, the masters of the dam patch it up. They do it again and again. They know that the dam will come down eventually. The question is when. But Russian politics is peculiar. They are not concerned with what happens beyond the current political cycle. Oh, the Russians are more naive, Peter. They think that the real breakdown won't happen for quite a few years yet, both at home and in the West, said Steve. They don't see the present leak in the dam as being serious enough for the West to do something stupid and blow up the world over it, as the Imperials may try to arrange in the end. They wouldn't believe me if I told them why you came here. Of course, there are plenty of hotheads in Russia, too, whose thinking is as shallow and as insanely deranged as that of our president. Some rouge elements in Russia may attempt to start something on their own perhaps, but this won't be anything big. A vast organizational structure must be activated before something big can be unleashed, and nobody that I have talked to sees any signs of such a thing happening. Steve folded his empty sandwich bag up and put it in his pocket. Does this answer your technical questions? He said, and began to grin, then laugh. Officially, you came here as a scientific genius to discuss a great scientific discovery that you have made. I think we have done this. We have discussed your discovery of the profound reality that the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many, because the principles that enable the needs of the one to be met enables everyone's needs to be met likewise. Isn't that what we've discussed? We discussed it socially, politically, and in the context of creating an Ice Age renaissance that we need to survive. Did we leave anything out? I shook my head and reached a hand out to him for a handshake. There is one more technicality you need to consider, Steve added during the handshake. This is the question of America's history of self-provocation. Self-provocation is a serious mental disease. America has been infected with it in a big way. It first surfaced in America when the Joint Chiefs of Staff had conspired to simply blow up one of their own Navy vessels to create a pretext for a war on Cuba. This happened during the Cuban conflicts. Luckily, their plan wasn't allowed to be implemented. President Kennedy stopped that, possibly in the last moment. A bit later we had the Gulf of Tonkin affair. It was a similar kind of self-provocation. This particular self-provocation was carried out on a pack of lies. Still, it got the U.S. military the green light to attack North Vietnam. Close to 3 million people lost their life over this one. And it was all provoked by a lie. But the granddad of all the self-provocation with lies was the one that dragged America into World War I. The war had already been won when Germany had rebuffed all the aggressors against it. It had offered an honorable peace to all parties involved. But the empire didn't want peace. It wanted world domination. And so it dug up a potential sex scandal out of the closet of the American president, who was promptly blackmailed into committing the USA to war in Europe to save the empire. Congress was pushed into this with a pack of lies. It was said that an American cruise ship was sank by German submarines with a massive loss of American lives. In reality, a tiny civilian ferry boat had been accidentally attacked that was merely damaged but remained afloat, on which one person was injured who wasn't even an American. On the strength of this pack of lies, America dragged itself into war, which was thereby prolonged and expanded to the point that another 50 million people lost their life. That's how empire operates, Peter. Its masters profited immensely from the horrific destruction of Europe that the extended war caused. This means that for as long as empire rules, your greatest danger lies in what remains typically unseen before it is too late. Thus, the process of self-provocation will likely be employed again and again by the masters of empire on an ever larger scale, and it will always be based on lies. So, don't react in haste, and remember that nearly all provocations are fundamentally rooted in lies. The point is, when a people become isolated from their sanity, as the principle of universal love gets pushed further and further out of sight, anything can happen, and has indeed already happened, and will continue to happen until the underlying platform has been uplifted to the point that empire rules no more. With having said this, Steve stood up and laughed again, heartily, suggesting that this concluded our talk. So, my friend, was it worthwhile for you to have come halfway around the world to hear me tell you what you already know, and have known for some time? I nodded. It was still nice to see you again, Steve. And yes, it was worthwhile to hear you say these things. Sometimes it is helpful to confirm to one another what we know to be true. It's a part of the evidence of the unity that exists. We need to see that evidence more and more in order to be able to move ahead with confidence and with authority. Steve laughed some more and agreed with a handshake. That's it, he said moments later, and reached for his newspaper that still lay on the park bench, and folded it up. I was surprised at how quickly the matter had been completed, for which I had traveled such a great distance. I was also glad that it ended quickly, because of the urgency of the matter. I told him that I would have loved to stay for the evening, for a chat over dinner, and to meet Tushi again, to discuss with her what the man on the plane had told me during the flight, on the subject of the oneness of all being. Normally it would be okay to do this, and then depart in the morning, I said to him. But with the president going nuts over this issue, any delay seemed unwise. Steve agreed. You have a talent in understating things, he said. Then he lamented about how shallow the thinking has become among the governing circles, that such a little glitch in the financial markets as has occurred would cause such a great panic that it nearly opened the door to nuclear war. I wonder how many times this has already happened in the past, said Steve. Steve did not smile this time and didn't answer. Instead, he accompanied me to my car, walking in silence. You better get back in a hurry, he added when we were halfway across the lawn, and tell your president from me that if he has the faintest spark of compassion for humanity, he must shut the presently unfolding world financial game down and reorganize the entire system from the ground up on a basis that reflects reality, and I don't mean the reality of the Imperial's insanity. As he said this, he grinned once again. Steve assured me while we stood by the car that it won't be easy for any president to actually do what needs to be done, even if he were to acknowledge that it is his job to protect society. In order to do anything meaningful, your president would have to put the present financial and economic system, which is founded on a lie, and is destroying itself, through a bankruptcy reorganization. then he must get back to the principle of universal unity by nationalizing the Federal Reserve System and align the USA with Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and so forth, to create a brand new world financial system that is constructed in accord with the real principle of economics, which reflects the general welfare principle founded on the principle of universal love. We used to call this kind of an arrangement a community of principle, added Steve. It reflects the Treaty of Westphalia principle of the advantage of the other. We should be getting back to that, I interrupted Steve. That should be happening on the global scale, Pete. Nothing short of an expanded version of the old historic principle will defeat the private feudal monetarist world order that is putting humanity ever deeper into the grave. So you see, it all comes back to the principle of universal love, Steve, I replied. And that's what's being trashed today, Peter, said Steve. I assured him that no president would be able to do anything about this, such as putting the entire world financial system through a bankruptcy reorganization, converting it from a private monetarist system that exists for looting into a cooperative world of national credit systems for building the nations up with efficient industrialization for economic development. This vital step, of course, won't be possible for as long as the illusion continues that the current system is still functioning. The president would then be accused of shutting down what appears to be a healthy economy. Consequently, it won't happen. Are you then telling me that we won't be able to do our job? Are you saying that we have no hope to ever awaken humanity from its illusions, including the president? Steve replied. That's worse than surrendering. It's criminal incompetence. To do nothing on this front, with the gravest tragedy looming on the horizon, amounts to committing genocide on an unimaginable scale. But you are not incompetent, Peter. You can do what needs to be done. Tell your president that he has no option but to do what must be done to protect humanity and our nation. Make it his task, and your task, to achieve that. If he has to develop the constituency for what needs to be done, help him with that too, Pete, or help him resign his post immediately. Failure in either direction is not an option. To do nothing must never be contemplated. The fact is, the president has no choice but to comply, and neither do we. He must shut the collapsing private world financial system down before it disintegrates, or else he must resign, and you must help him. He must not be allowed to let the entire world be overwhelmed by the consequences of his failure to fulfill the mandate of his office. We mustn't let this happen. I promised Steve I would pass his message on. No, passing on won't do. You must actively educate the president to do what must be done. Tell him to be honest with himself. You must make him understand what is involved. There is only one type of solution possible, and this can only be assured if the underlying principle is completely understood. If he can't understand that, he must go, and he must be made to understand that he must go. You must understand this yourself, Pete. Simply eliminating artificial barriers does not create unity between people. The principle of their unity must be understood. Simply firing an incompetent ruler doesn't create a new world. The principle of competent living must be understood for what it is. The president needs to understand this in order to comply. Actually, Peter, much more than the president, society needs to understand the principle of competent living and comply. In a democratic world, society is the king. Unfortunately, in our present world, this king has become more incompetent than even the president is. That's the bottom line, Peter. Society is the real king in a democracy. Democracy means that society is taking responsibility for its general welfare. In America, the real king has become incompetent, which is society. That needs to be reversed. And the first thing this real king has to do is get rid of the imposter. I raise my hand. Now I understand, Steve, what you've been saying all along. You've been saying that the real king is society itself, and not the president. If society is incompetent, then the president is merely following its lead. If society refuses to be king, can you blame the man for wanting to fill the vacancy? Now you're getting the idea, said Steve, and laughed. But now you have a lot of work to do. You've also been saying that while we can replace the president, we can never replace society. We can only heal society by educating it in the science of the principle of competent living. That's what is really demanded of us, isn't it? Society, once it is healed, will then be able to deal with its president from its position as the real king, and the imposter will remove itself. Steve nodded and grinned. He motioned me to go on. I suppose what you are also saying to me is that it would be the kindest and most affectionate and daring step that any one of us could take, if we were to go to the president and have a talk with him, that we offer him an equitable solution that would rescue the man from his folly before society acts from its position as the king and forces a solution. Steve nodded and put his hand on my shoulder. Didn't I say those very words loud and clear right at the beginning? Didn't I say that the president should be helped to resign? The point is that we are all in this boat together, the president too. There is no shame for a person resigning from the toughest leadership job that only a few in the world are truly qualified for, and admit incompetence on this ground. But there is terrible shame, Peter, if the legitimate king, which is society itself, is incompetent. This should never happen, because a democratic society, which is the real king, cannot resign itself or be dismissed. Well, what could I say to that? I had personally experienced in Steve's own home the power of the principle that he was talking about, the power of the principle of universal love that can heal every wound, and the power of the principle of the universal brotherhood of all mankind that builds civilizations. We can't resign from the responsibility to uphold these principles, and why should we? Steve was totally right about those principles. I certainly wouldn't have lasted for more than 5 minutes in his house without the guidance of these principles that neither of us really understood at the time, but which we had lived by, to our highest ability as human beings, which we thereby had explored together. Without that, my day with Lucy, when we first met, would have ended in short order. It would have ended when I met her on the beach in Leipzig. Instead, I fell in love with her, and that never really ended. From that moment on, it enriched us all, beginning that very night. I told Steve so. Steve agreed with a big grin on his face. Then he took a couple of steps back and began to laugh out loud. You don't honestly believe that your incredibly good looks had anything to do with inspiring Ushi's love? He shook his head while he laughed. What happened that day, Peter, happened because of those principles. And that can happen again universally all over the world, my friend. Just look at us. Neither of us is an extraordinary genius. We are human beings. If we can be moved by the universal principles of our humanity, then anybody can be moved by them. It's as simple as that. Don't make it complicated, Peter. Well, that's the way Steve was. He had his way of dramatizing things to get a point across. After all, that was his profession as a teacher and leading-edge scientist. We had a good laugh together over this as we said goodbye at my car, joking about our non-existing incredible good looks that had no influence whatsoever on the unity that had developed between us. With this hearty laughter, our meeting was concluded. As I got into the car, he wished me farewell with his usual smile and gentle handshake. 4 hours later, I was back in the Western world, where I boarded the last plane leaving Frankfurt for New York, connecting with the red-eye special to Washington, D.C. Fred got his initial debriefing within minutes of my arrival in New York, with the full details laid out at an official meeting in his office the next morning. Fred understood what I was saying on Steve's behalf about the president. He shook his head. He nearly cried, since he knew that Steve was right, while he also knew that Steve's requests could not be fulfilled. That won't be possible to implement, he said to me privately. But we must try, I said, after long moments of silence. I will prevail upon the president to solicit competent advice, but don't hold your breath. Also, don't expect me to suggest that he resign. In any case, this would have to come from Congress by way of the will of the people, and I don't see any hope for that to happen anytime soon. I am sure your friend Steve will understand this. Didn't he admit himself that the real king hasn't yet awoken? Steve understands, I replied. He also understands that America will not survive in the long run if a new direction isn't taken soon, which we both know the president isn't able to take by reasons of his incompetence. But why should we wait for the world to change, Fred? You and I are a part of society. The awakening has begun. The task falls on us to assume the office of the king. This means that the president, who assumed the role of king as an impostor, must go. He must go, or the nation will suffer the consequences. Since the consequences may be on a scale that the whole world might not survive them, it falls on us to take on the leading role in society and be the acting king. That is what Steve said in essence. You ask Steve for his advice. This is his advice. Our president asked Steve for his help. Now we must convey to the president Steve's answer. What I told you is Steve's best advice. Also, it is really the only option that we have to help mankind to have a future. I suggest that you put it all down in writing, said Fred. Place every word of it into your report to the president, which he may read. Put it down honestly, just as Steve has said it. Don't water it down. I reached my hand and promised to do this. My smile seemed to startle him. One day the president may thank you for delivering such a report, I said to Fred, and began to laugh. Also tell him that Steve and I have decided to fight for America in a big way, to rescue America. We decided to launch the biggest fight in history for the freedom of America. We'll flood the world with love and a commitment to win. If we fail, the world is doomed. Will you join us, Fred? Fred began to laugh too. I will deliver your report if you will sign it under oath, he said. This appeared to be Fred's way of saying that he agreed with me, but didn't want to admit it. He didn't say anything about joining us either, as if he was saying, thanks for joining me. Okay, I will sign the report any way you like. That's not a problem. Anything else, Fred? I asked. He just continued laughing. Oh, get out of here and take a few days off after the report is written, he said between bursts of laughter, as if the whole affair had become the funniest joke. He laughed and said something about us finally waking up. I want you out of here, he added, and look after Sylvia before things become even scarier for me than they already are. He also said something about him owing a great debt to Sylvia. He stopped halfway through the sentence when the phone rang.